My brother broke the one rule I had, nearly cost me my family, and then showed up at dinner holding a glass of wine like nothing had happened. I remember the sound of the glass touching the table, a soft click, too soft for what had just been done. My brother leaned, back in his chair, calm as ever, while my wife stared at him with tears gathering in her eyes. My daughter sat beside her, silent, gripping the edge of her sleeve. I looked at my brother and asked the question I had already asked him 3 times. Why didn't you stop? He took another sip. Then he smiled. He's still breathing, isn't he? That sentence changed everything. Because there had been one rule between us since childhood: never interfere with my family, never bring your problems to my home, and most importantly, never threaten the people I loved just to punish me. He had broken every part of it. What he didn't know was that I had already stopped arguing. I was listening, watching, remembering, and quietly deciding what I would do next. I had spent most of my life being the brother who stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I learned early that silence revealed more than arguments ever could. My brother Daniel was different. He walked into rooms expecting people to move for him. He spoke first, demanded answers, and treated apologies like favors he was doing for other people. We were only 3 years apart, but somehow we grew into opposite men. I built my life slowly. A modest home, a steady marriage, 2 children, and a small business I protected with the same patience I used to protect my family. Daniel built his life around shortcuts. When something went wrong, he looked for someone else to blame. For years, I covered for him. I paid debts he promised to repay. I answered calls when everyone else stopped. I even lied to our parents about how badly things had gotten, because I thought protecting my brother was part of being a good brother. He mistook that patience for permission. My wife never trusted him. She rarely said why, but I noticed how she locked the door after he left and how her shoulders tightened whenever his name appeared on her phone. I noticed everything. I simply chose not to make everything a fight. That was my mistake. People often underestimate quiet men because they confuse restraint with surrender. Daniel did too. He believed I would always clean up after him. He never considered what would happen when I finally decided to stop. The first warning came disguised as a favor. Daniel asked if he could use my office while I was away for the weekend. I agreed, but when I returned, I found one of my locked drawers slightly open. Nothing was missing. That was what bothered me. When I asked him about it, he barely looked up from his phone. Relax, I was looking for something. I waited. What? He smiled without answering. A week later, he arrived 20 minutes late to my daughter's birthday dinner, carrying a gift bag that was clearly empty. He kissed her forehead, glanced around the room, and said, "You really know how to make a small place look expensive." My wife heard it. So did I. Neither of us responded. Then came the phone calls. Daniel began asking questions about my business, my schedule, and when my wife would be home. Each question sounded casual. None of them felt casual. One evening, I found him standing near my driveway gate, watching my son practice outside. "You should keep better track of him," he said quietly. I looked at him. "He's fine." Daniel shrugged. "I'm just saying." He walked away before I could ask what he meant. That night, my wife sat across from me at the kitchen table, her untouched tea growing cold between us. "Something is wrong with him," she whispered. I already knew. The small betrayals were becoming a pattern, and patterns, I had learned, were rarely accidents. Still, I believed I could handle Daniel quietly. I was wrong about that. The moment I realized enough was enough came on an ordinary Tuesday. My wife called me at work, but she didn't speak when I answered. I heard her breathing, then my daughter's voice in the background. "Mom, why is Uncle Daniel here?" I stood so quickly my chair rolled backward. By the time I reached home, Daniel was already gone. My wife was sitting on the front steps, pale and shaking. She told me he had come without warning. He had asked where I kept certain business documents and demanded to know why. I had stopped helping him financially. When she refused to answer, his tone changed. Not loud, worse, cold. He told her that if I continued ignoring him, I would regret it. That sentence settled something inside me. For years, I had believed family problems should stay within the family, but Daniel had already stopped treating us like family. I went inside and checked the security footage. There he was, entering through the side gate. Then I watched him pause beside my daughter's bicycle. He looked directly toward the camera and smiled. I replayed it twice. That was when I understood. He wasn't careless. He was testing me, so I stopped reacting. I changed the locks, preserved every message, saved every recording, told my wife exactly what I was doing. Then I contacted someone. Daniel had spent months trying to intimidate a person who had every reason to document his behavior. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix my brother. I was preparing to let his own choices speak for him. I didn't threaten Daniel. I didn't confront him. I simply stopped giving him anything he could use against me. First, I changed every lock and security code around the house. Then I moved important documents out of my home and stored copies somewhere he couldn't access. Next, I spoke with a lawyer. I brought everything: the messages, security footage, financial records, and a written timeline of every incident. The lawyer didn't tell me to take revenge. He told me to document facts, avoid direct confrontation, and let Daniel create his own record. That was exactly what I needed. I also contacted my bank and separated every account Daniel had ever known about. Any remaining financial connection between us disappeared quietly. Then I did something Daniel never expected. I stopped answering his calls. Not blocked, not argued with, ignored. Every message went into a folder. Every visit was recorded by the cameras. Every threat was preserved. My wife and I also agreed on one rule. Nobody would meet Daniel alone anymore. I wasn't building a trap. I was building distance. Daniel had always relied on chaos. He knew how to survive arguments because arguments gave him room to manipulate people. So I gave him nothing. No anger, no explanations. No second chances disguised as conversations. Within 3 weeks, Daniel became frustrated. He started calling relatives. He told them I was abandoning him. Some believed him. I didn't defend myself. I knew the truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to survive long enough to be seen. The payoff didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened quietly, one door closing after another. Daniel had expected me to panic when he realized I was no longer answering. Instead, he began making mistakes. He contacted relatives with different versions of the same story. Then he sent messages contradicting things he'd already told me. I saved everything. When he eventually demanded money again, I didn't argue. My lawyer sent one formal response explaining that all future communication needed to be in writing. Daniel called me 17 times that afternoon. I answered none. A week later, the person Daniel had been pressuring finally came forward with records of his own. There were unpaid debts, false promises, and messages that showed Daniel had been using my name to make people believe I would cover whatever he owed. That was the part that finally broke his story apart. Our relatives stopped defending him. My parents called me, not to ask me to forgive him, but to apologize for believing him. Then came the dinner. Daniel arrived unexpectedly, wearing the same confident expression he had carried for years. He sat down with a glass of wine. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me. "Why didn't you stop?" I knew exactly what he meant. I looked at the glass in his hand. "You mean when you threatened my family?" His smile disappeared. "He's still breathing, isn't he?" he said. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood, placed the documents on the table, and slid them toward him. His eyes moved across the pages. For once, Daniel had nothing to say, and I realized I didn't need revenge anymore. His own choices had already delivered it. The consequences were quieter than I expected. Daniel didn't lose everything overnight. There was no dramatic confrontation, no room full of people screaming at him. People simply stopped trusting him. My parents stopped giving him money. Relatives stopped answering whenever he called with another emergency. The people he had once convinced to believe his stories began comparing notes, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. My wife changed too. For months, I had watched her become careful inside our own home. She checked the locks twice. She stopped leaving the children alone outside. She listened for cars slowing near the driveway. Now, slowly, those habits disappeared. One evening, she left the front door unlocked while carrying groceries inside. I noticed. She noticed me noticing. Neither of us said anything. That small moment meant more than any apology could have. My children never learned every detail. They didn't need to. They only needed to know that our home was safe again. As for me, I had to face something uncomfortable. I had spent years believing that protecting family meant absorbing their damage. It didn't. Sometimes protecting your family means refusing to let someone else's chaos enter their lives. Daniel's reputation collapsed because people finally saw his choices without me, standing behind him. And that mattered. Because the real cost of betrayal isn't always money or broken relationships. Sometimes it's discovering that the person you defended for years never respected the sacrifice. If you've ever been the one expected to forgive endlessly, remember this. Loyalty without boundaries isn't love, it's permission. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is quietly revoke it. A year has passed since that dinner. Sometimes I still think about the glass of wine in Daniel's hand and how casually he spoke after nearly tearing my family apart. But I don't feel anger anymore. That's the part I never expected. I used to think revenge meant making someone feel the pain they had caused me. I understand now that real satisfaction came from something much quieter. Removing their ability to keep hurting the people I loved. Daniel eventually moved away. There were no final speeches between us. No dramatic reconciliation. Just distance, paperwork, and a silence that became permanent. My parents still speak to him occasionally. But they no longer ask me to repair what he broke. My children grew older without having to understand every ugly detail. And my wife finally stopped checking the driveway every time a car passed. Our home became peaceful again. I also became different. I stopped apologizing for boundaries. I stopped explaining every decision to people determined to misunderstand it. Most importantly, I stopped confusing forgiveness with access. Maybe one day Daniel will understand what he lost. Maybe he won't. That no longer controls my life. What matters is that tomorrow belongs to me, my wife, and our children. We are building a future without constantly looking over our shoulders. I didn't destroy my brother. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. And in the quiet that followed, I discovered something better than revenge. I got my life back. He thought my silence meant I had surrendered. He never realized it was the moment I finally chose peace.